It was a crisp autumn evening when Jessica moved into her new home. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze as she stood on the porch, surveying the quaint neighborhood that would soon become her own little corner of the world. Her parents were out running errands, leaving her to unpack and settle in on her own. As Jessica stepped through the front door, a sense of excitement bubbled within her. This was the start of a new chapter in her life, a chance to make memories and create a space that felt uniquely hers. The house was old, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows, but Jessica loved it all the same. She spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, her mind buzzing with plans for the future. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jessica decided to call it a day. She climbed into bed, the scent of fresh paint lingering in the air, and drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face. But as the hours passed and the house grew still, Jessica's peaceful slumber was shattered by a series of strange noises. At first, she dismissed them as the sounds of settling, but as they grew louder and more persistent, her curiosity turned to unease. With a sigh, Jessica climbed out of bed and made her way downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the moon shining through the windows. As Jessica reached the bottom of the staircase, she froze in her tracks. A cold chill ran down her spine as she realized that she was not alone. There, standing in the hallway, was a figure cloaked in shadow. For a moment, Jessica's mind raced with fear. Who was this intruder, and what did they want? But before she could gather her wits, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving Jessica alone in the darkness. Shaken but determined, Jessica flicked on the lights and searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of the mysterious intruder. With a sigh of relief, she convinced herself that it had all been a figment of her imagination and returned to bed, hoping to put the incident behind her. But as the days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen in the house. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in odd places days later. Doors would slam shut of their own accord, and footsteps could be heard echoing through the halls late at night. At first, Jessica tried to rationalize the occurrences, chalking them up to the quirks of an old house. But as the disturbances grew more frequent and more intense, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Desperate for answers, Jessica began researching the history of her new home, hoping to uncover some clue as to what was happening. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. It turned out that her house had a dark and troubled past. Decades earlier, it had been the site of a gruesome murder, and the restless spirits of the victims were said to haunt its halls to this day. Terrified but determined, Jessica refused to be driven from her home by the specters that lurked within its walls. Instead, she sought out the help of a local medium, hoping to communicate with the spirits and find a way to bring peace to their restless souls. With the medium's guidance, Jessica embarked on a journey into the unknown, delving deep into the dark and twisted history of her home. What she discovered was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The spirits that haunted her house were not content to simply linger in the shadows. They were angry, vengeful entities hell-bent on wreaking havoc on anyone who dared to cross their path. Determined to put an end to the haunting once and for all, Jessica embarked on a quest to uncover the truth behind the murders that had stained her home with blood. With the help of the medium and a team of paranormal investigators, She unearthed long-buried secrets and exposed the dark forces that had been lurking in the shadows all along. In the end, Jessica was able to bring peace to the restless spirits and rid her home of the darkness that had plagued it for so long. But the experience had changed her in ways she could never have anticipated. Haunted by the memories of the horrors she had witnessed, Jessica vowed to never forget the lessons she had learned and to always cherish the moments of peace and tranquility that she had fought so hard to achieve. And though she had faced unimaginable terrors and stared into the abyss of darkness, Jessica emerged from the ordeal stronger and more resilient than ever before, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold. On a stormy night in November, Emily found herself home alone. The rain drummed relentlessly against the windows, and the wind howled like a restless spirit outside. Her parents had gone out for a dinner party, leaving her with strict instructions to lock all the doors and windows and to call them if anything seemed amiss. As Emily sat in the living room, the only light emanating from the flickering TV screen, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She brushed it off as her imagination running wild, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, Emily decided it was time for bed. She made her way up the creaky staircase, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty house. Once in her room, she double-checked the locks on her door and windows before slipping under the covers. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard the faint sound of footsteps downstairs. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was just the house settling or the branches scraping against the window. But the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, and Emily's heart began to race. She grabbed her phone and dialed her parents' number, but there was no answer. Panic rising in her chest, Emily hesitated for a moment before deciding to investigate. With trembling hands, she grabbed a baseball bat from her closet and crept downstairs. The house was eerily silent now, the only sound her own ragged breaths. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Emily froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. And then she heard a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of the storm outside. "Emily." Her blood turned to ice as she realized that the voice didn't belong to her parents. It was low, almost guttural, sending a shiver down her spine. Summoning all her courage, Emily tiptoed towards the source of the sound, the basement. The door creaked open ominously as she descended into the darkness below. The basement was musty and dimly lit, the only light coming from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, casting eerie shadows in every direction. And then she saw him, a man standing in the far corner, his back to her. He seemed to be rummaging through the boxes, his movements frantic and disjointed. Heart pounding in her chest, Emily raised the bat, ready to defend herself if necessary. But before she could make a move, the man turned towards her, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. For a moment they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. And then, without a word, the man turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the basement. Emily wasted no time. She raced back upstairs, locking the basement door behind her before calling the police. By the time they arrived, the intruder was long gone, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a lingering sense of dread. To this day, Emily can't shake the feeling that she narrowly escaped a fate worse than she could have imagined. It was a stifling summer night when Michael found himself alone at home. The oppressive heat seemed to suffocate him as he sat on the couch, idly flipping through channels on the TV. His parents had left earlier in the day for a weekend getaway, leaving him to fend for himself. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael's unease grew. The house felt strangely empty without the comforting presence of his parents, and every creak and groan seemed amplified in the silence. Around midnight, Michael decided it was time to retreat to the sanctuary of his room. He trudged up the stairs, the heavy weight of the humid air pressing down on him. Once in his room, he closed the door and flopped onto his bed, hoping to find respite from the oppressive heat. But just as he was about to drift off to sleep, his phone rang. Startled, Michael glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. His first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of him, and he answered hesitantly. "Hello," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Static crackled on the other end of the line, followed by a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down Michael's spine. "Michael." His heart skipped a beat as the voice spoke his name, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He tried to speak, but fear had paralyzed his vocal cords, leaving him unable to form coherent words. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an oppressive sense of dread. Michael's pulse quickened, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the line went dead, leaving Michael in a state of shock. He stared at his phone, his mind racing with a million questions and no answers. Before he could gather his thoughts, the phone rang again. With trembling hands, Michael answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is this?" But there was no response, only silence on the other end of the line. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that someone was watching him, even when he was alone. Terrified, Michael hung up the phone and frantically dialed his parents' number, but there was no answer. Desperate for reassurance, he considered calling the police, but fear held him back. Instead, Michael spent the rest of the night huddled in his room, the phone clutched tightly in his hand. And though the calls eventually stopped, the sense of unease lingered long after the sun rose. To this day, Michael can't shake the feeling that he was not alone that night, that something sinister was lurking just beyond the reach of his understanding.